It is a regular dilemma for preachers on the morning after a significant event, whether to throw out the finished sermon and try to appear up to date, or to keep to the scheduled topic and at least appear well prepared. I want simply to say that my heart is raw and heavy with the weakening of the Voting Rights Act and last night's verdict of the George Zimmerman trial, and what all these decisions imply, especially for my African American friends and family. I'm so grateful to be in this space with all of you after several years away. I've missed this congregation terribly, and it's good to be together, especially when the news is difficult. But I wanted you to know that I recognize the inadequacy of my speaking about my research this morning when there's so much else that might be said. The work that I've been doing for my dissertation these last 6 years is about how people in the United States have tried to find knowledge that they could trust in the midst of complicated circumstances. Specifically, how have we found a place for scientific knowledge in our spiritual and religious beliefs? As I discuss this topic in the dozen Unitarian Universalist congregations I regularly visit around the state, the questions that most often arise are, in the face of so much information, so many claims and reassurances, how can we know what to believe? How can we know which claims to trust? The search for reliable knowledge in the midst of a changing world is truly one of the oldest questions in recorded human thought. One of the first Greek philosophers, Heraclitus of Ephesus, famously observed 2,500 years ago that we cannot step in the same river twice, that we cannot know the world reliably when it is essentially a moving target. In the centuries that followed, our responses to this question have generally come in two forms. We can either insist on an eternal and unchanging answer and defend that position in the face of new discoveries and situations, or we can find other values to unite us while our beliefs evolve in response to our circumstances. The work of liberal religion, particularly Unitarian Universalism, has been to demonstrate that it is possible to find sense and make meaning in a complex and changing world, but it requires us to relinquish some of the idols that we have historically clung to. I'd like to invite you to call upon your memory of a recent moment that touched you to your core. Not necessarily a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but nonetheless one that stood out from the background of your everyday routine. What can you remember about that moment? How did you feel it in your body? What emotions arose during that encounter? What thoughts did you experience? And then, how did you make sense of it? As many of you know, it was in the world of science that I first sought answers to the big questions. As far back as the first grade, I was writing in crayon that I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up, so that, as I said, I could study bacteria and dope. Apparently, I was a very worldly first grader. I understood the world as expressing patterns and following laws, as events that could be measured and analyzed. This path eventually led me to a good job with the space program, but by then the cracks in my worldview were already starting to show. It wasn't that my experiences violated the principles of science, but that some of them were clearly more meaningful when I thought about them in a different way. I think especially about a retreat I was on near Asheville, North Carolina, when I would wake every morning before dawn to climb the fire watch tower outside of our cabin. Shivering high up on the exposed platform, occupying one of the highest points east of the Mississippi, I watched as the sunlight set the peaks ablaze in all directions. And my first response was also my first authentic experience of prayer. Not to the traditional Father God, in fact, not to anyone at all, but simply a heartfelt explosion of wonder and gratitude that the world could be patterned and lawful and stirring in a way that I can feel in my body even as I'm retelling it to you today. It was not long after that I began my studies and training to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. I was still devoted to the path of the scientist, but I understood that there could be more if I wanted it. For example, why were people so fascinated by the biblical stories about the exceptions to the laws of nature? And why did religious institutions want us to believe that this told us something fundamentally true about the universe? The world of religion was still a mystery to me, but I wasn't yet ready to resolve it by either embracing church doctrine unquestioningly or reducing it all to physics. For the time being, at least, I was content to enjoy it as a mystery. Many of the historical figures I study in my research, however, were troubled by the tensions between religious and scientific explanations. In the United States, in the early 1800s, the emerging fields of astronomy, geology, and anthropology made enormous advances, some of which appeared to contradict the creation stories in the Bible. Our reading from William Ellery Channing comes from the midst of these tensions and exemplifies the liberal struggle to weigh new evidence against what we believe we already know. He chose as the text for this sermon the Bible quote printed on the cover of your order of service. "Do not quench the spirit, do not despise the words of the prophets, but test everything and hold fast to what is good." This message is from a letter of Paul of Tarsus, urging a new congregation to welcome both new insight and the wisdom of the ages, but questioning it all and keeping only what passes for truth. Channing urged those present on that spring day in 1819 to apply the same skepticism to all knowledge, even that of the Bible. The title of this sermon alludes to a phrase that many of you will recognize, the famous Sifting and Winnowing proclamation issued after University of Wisconsin economics professor Richard Ely successfully defended himself in 1894 against charges of exposing students to controversial teachings. The sentiment that the words of all authorities be open to question, which Channing urged upon his shocked audience, which Eli's acquittal affirmed, represents a Wisconsin tradition of intellectual freedom that is precious to many of us. The United States in Channing's time was a hotbed of experimental scientific and religious movements with a need for considerable sifting and winnowing. The intellectually curious could explore a variety of unconventional practices, including spiritualism, phrenology, mesmerism, water cures, homeopathy, and Christian Science. Many of these experimental traditions were dismissed or even denounced by religious or scientific experts, but the very power of these authorities was crumbling as well. A powerful philosophical tradition was spreading that undermined our trust in experts and shifted authority to the ordinary individual instead. This Scottish school of thought, called common sense realism, taught that truth is not the property only of well-educated and highly trained people, but of the common person as well. Because each of us already possesses the faculties to understand the world. We don't need an ordained priest or a university-trained scholar for us to know what's true. At first blush, this radically democratic approach to knowledge sounds pretty appealing. It's important to note, however, that common sense has also produced some patently irrational positions as well. For example, common sense was one of the most powerful arguments against the claims of Copernicus and Galileo that the sun occupies the center of the solar system. After all, it really does look like the sun is revolving around us, and the Bible speaks of the sun rising and setting, and we would surely feel it if the earth were actually hurtling through space, right? In the religious world, too, common sense theology has had surprising results. Its most prominent product in the United States, after all, was Christian fundamentalism. We continue to feel the reverberations of the common sense tradition today in our nation's chronic suspicion toward educated experts and the widespread insistence that any opinion is as valid as another. As our reading from Martin Gardner laments, nowhere is this more frustrating than in our ignorance of science and our eager embrace of what some call pseudosciences, fields of knowledge that profess to be science but are not actually held to scientific standards. Only half of American adults know that the Earth orbits the sun once a year. And the anti-evolutionist Stephen Meyer's new book, Darwin's Doubt, debuted this week at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. A friend of mine joked, we're not sure if it's on the fiction or nonfiction list. I know that John shares my frustration at these figures, which he calls an aggressive denial of reality. 2 weeks from today, I'm going to be preaching about science and religion to the Cross Street Unitarian Chapel in Manchester, England. And one of the things I'm going to have to try to explain to them is why so many Americans reject scientific findings. I recently held a half-day workshop on religion and science for our congregation up in Door County, and it was clear that, except for the 2 professional scientists in the group, the most pressing problem was scientific illiteracy. Nearly every one of them complained about not knowing what to believe. They wonder when tobacco companies hire scientists to testify that smoking is not dangerous, and conservative leaders cite scientific figures to claim that abstinence-only education prevents teenage pregnancies, what are we to believe? When actress and Playboy model Jenny McCarthy claims a scientific connection between vaccination and autism, but admits that her credentials are solely from what she calls the University of Google, what are we to believe? Members of the congregations I regularly work with tell me that they're overwhelmed and confused about the proper place of scientific knowledge. Most ordinary people find it too difficult to understand science publications, and 80% of Americans find even the science section of the New York Times too confusing to follow. In addition to those who don't understand science, there are quite a few people who simply dispute its legitimacy. Some religious conservatives insist that the biblical account offers a more accurate explanation of our world. Some people reject science's focus on the material world and prefer instead spirituality, poetry, or magic as an explanation. Others still suspect that economic interests of big oil, big pharma, and big agro have made scientific conclusions untrustworthy. How do we judge when so many claims are competing for our loyalty? This This is perhaps the central challenge for Unitarian Universalists. Our devotion to the value of fairness makes many of us unwilling to label some beliefs as less legitimate than others. After all, we would likely resent someone else telling us that our beliefs are foolish or inferior, so what business do we have telling others? Our most common response to this tension has been live and let live, to simply celebrate everyone doing their own thing. Is it enough for each individual to say, well, it's true for me? I'm dissatisfied with this at one level, because it implies that all claims are equally valuable. This has been the historical problem with the common sense tradition of religion. It's radically democratic, sure, but it doesn't equip us to judge between competing claims. And at a social level, this approach becomes alarming because it reduces the common good to the individual good, a trend we're also seeing in current efforts to privatize public institutions such as education, postal services, and fire and police protection. It's not enough for everyone to simply do their own thing. And I'd like to offer 3 suggestions about how we might bring our individual beliefs into respectful dialogue. The first suggestion is something I've been advocating for years as a minister, but I'm now giving it more attention as a historian. When I'm talking with someone whose beliefs conflict with my own, I try to understand what's really at stake for us both. For example, why do I insist on a scientific worldview? Is what I'm really saying that I'm convinced that the universe obeys natural laws with no exceptions? I mentioned earlier my experience with prayer at the top of that fire watch tower. And it would be easy for some to assume that this means I believe in magical thinking and a God who grants wishes. My comfort with prayer probably makes more sense when you know that for me it's simply an expression of gratitude or wonder and not directed at anyone or anything else. We need to be willing to reflect on why we believe what we believe and be willing to share those underlying commitments with one another in our dialogue. My second suggestion comes to us from the history of science. 17th century English philosopher Francis Bacon noted that people were confining their descriptions of the world to 2 categories, natural and supernatural. If people encountered some new phenomenon that didn't appear to obey the laws of nature, they simply concluded that it was God or demons at work. In addition to the categories of natural and supernatural, though, Bacon suggested that we add a third, the preternatural. Events that did not appear to be natural but had no evidence for being supernatural, he urged us to simply embrace as questions that were not yet answered. I believe that a willingness to love these questions as they are would do a great deal for our dialogue. The third category allows us to say, there are mysteries around us. But we're not going to shut down our questioning and simply file them away as supernatural. We want to keep wrestling with them for a better explanation. And this leads me to my third suggestion, that we not ever give up on our questioning and our critical thinking. It's easy for us in such a flood of conflicting information to throw up our hands and stop engaging entirely with the latest news, or to conclude that both sides are a little bit right and a little bit wrong, and therefore they're equally legitimate. Many Americans have done exactly this, and we let our frustration solidify into apathy and cynicism, which I believe is the most destructive of responses. Voltaire joked, "Uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one." We must continue to engage with the world, as challenging as it is, and make what meaning we can from its overwhelm of messages. The universe trumpets to us, and a mighty curiosity in us sings a response. What shall we do with that response? I'm not as interested in insisting on a scientific answer as some might expect of me, but what I do plead for is this, that we recognize that we are not alone in grasping for truth, and that we not shrink from engaging with the questions and wrestling with the answers. Whether your humble responses are those of the physicist or the poet or something in between, your voice is needed. For this mighty hubbub is nature struggling to comprehend itself. And I believe that no note honestly sung is wasted.